Let's head to South Africa. April 27th every year, South Africans come together to celebrate Freedom Day, a day set aside to celebrate independence from white supremacy and slavery that lasted centuries. Now, Freedom Day 2024 marks the 30th anniversary of South Africa's democratic dispensation and commemorates the nation's first democratic election on the 27th of April 1994. Celebrated under the theme 30 Years of Democracy, Partnership and Growth, this year's Freedom Month celebration hold a special significance as they also coincide with the 28th anniversary of the enactment of the South African Constitution as the supreme law of the land. Now, Sipho Seepe, an independent analyst, joins me for more on this from Gauteng, South Africa. Thank you for your time, Sipho. Now, great. In your opinion, how would you describe the significance of Freedom Day in South Africa and its impact on the country's history?
Because it brought an end to British colonial rule and apartheid. You need to understand that South Africans had been under the yoke of colonialism for over 300 years. So for the first time, South Africans of African descent felt that they have an opportunity to decide their fate, with a fate that has always been decided by largely the colonial masters. So it is significant in that. It's also significant at the continental level, because South Africa was the last country to achieve political independence. So it reflected the dream of the founding fathers of the African Organization for African Unity, now the AU, who also spared no effort to make sure that the rest of the continent becomes free from the yoke of colonialism. But our freedoms were largely political. They were not economic. So in as much as there is a sense of celebration on the political front, in a sense that the South Africans can now vote, including people who were excluded. But on the economic front, we still find ourselves under the same conditions that we inherited from apartheid.
I would like you to expatiate more on the economic front. You said on the political space, there's the freedom there, but economically, the country is still not free. Would you like to tell us more with specifics?
Well, what we did, we adopted a constitution that is a liberal constitution. And the problem with liberal constitution is that they assume that everybody starts from the same space. Hence, they talk about equality, not equity. What we should have done as South Africans was also to find a mechanism that will address the historical injustices that occurred, especially as far as the social and economic disintegration of the Black life. So post-1994, we found ourselves reproducing the same inequalities. And some people argue that for the last 30 years, we've seen more escalation of racial disparities and also social hierarchies that were created by both apartheid and colonialism. So in as much as we are celebrating, we must also be looking at the major missteps that we made. First, we adopted everything that was there in the system. And if you take over a system and all you do, you replace it with black faces, you don't change that system. So what is underwritten as conditions and the sustenance of racial disparities remains in the system. So this is why you find that there's been more reproduction of the same inequalities to an extent that South Africa right now is now the global poster child of inequality. So we had failed dismally in that regard. Yet, yes, you have some people who have become modern day elites. Those were people who were microwaved into becoming millionaires by the people who oppressed us. And they have found comfort in the sense that they've been co-opted and they now behave as the new oppressors of the formerly oppressed.
I mean, I'm still going to stay with you on this, but according to a particular survey I'm looking at right now on the npr.org, it says that there were about 27,494 killings in South Africa in the year to February, that's 2023, compared, with what it was in terms of the homicide rate, about 45%, increase. Now, my question is this. Talking about the rate of violence in South Africa, what do you think, is responsible for this? Some ratings would even say South Africa in terms of violence or risk factor is one of the violent, if not the most violent place, on the African continent. So my question is this: what do you think is responsible for that? And how do you think a day like this would sort of impact on the country to trend more towards the place of peace as against this kinds of ratings?
Well, first, when people are in the conditions of hopelessness and in the conditions of degrading poverty, what you are creating is an environment where crime can manifest and thrive. So the failure by the new dispensation to ensure that there's economic growth, to ensure that the people are employed, has led to where the crime levels are so high, because everybody is actually desperate to eke a living. So part of the crisis that we face is that sense of poverty that is grinding. It's unemployment that is exorbitant. It's also a sense of hopelessness. So what you find is that people will then resort to other measures other than what you may call proper gainful employment measures that comes with when one has a job. So the crisis we have in South Africa is a triple type of crisis. Is inequality, which itself is racial. It's poverty, which has deepened, which also has a color that is black. It's also the notion of unemployment, which affects largely African people. So a combination of that creates almost a scenario where the convergence of all these factors leads to people becoming desperate, and hence we've become the capital murder of the world.
All right. Now, are there any disparities in the experiences of different groups of ordinary citizens in the country, which, of course, when it comes to benefiting from the ideals of freedom and democracy celebrated on Freedom Day?
Well, Africans are by and large concentrated in conditions of squalor. And if you look at anywhere in the world where you find conditions of squalor, you also find an element of violence. When it comes to also employment, Africans are in the main the ones who are unemployed and unemployable, whereas white people, in terms of employment, their numbers are very low. They are actually below 10. When you talk about Africans, you're talking about more than 50% of people who should be in jobs being almost unemployed and unemployable. So that the post-1994 scenario still reflects the same architect of apartheid, and hence the sense of desperation and the sense of hopelessness.
How do you think the government and civil society can actually work together to ensure that the celebration of Freedom Day continues to have a positive impact on the lives of ordinary citizens in South Africa?
We have two types of, when you talk about civil society, you have ordinary mass organization by African people, but you also have groupings that masquerade themselves as custodians and defenders of democracy. These are largely the think tanks that have a lot of money and are sponsored from outside. These have actually also become part of the problem, because what they do, they spend more time defending white interest and also sustaining white hegemony and white supremacy. So what is going to be required for us to change this is nothing short of a revolution that will require mass mobilization of African people to say this dispensation has not worked for you, and for them to find a way in which they vote for parties that will speak a language that says the past policies have not worked. What we need is something radical in uprooting the architecture of apartheid, and also making sure that the black people assume primacy in terms of the policies of government, and to make sure that we do not shy in talking about the the need to redress the past inequalities that are racial. But what we've tried to do, we try to be accommodative. We talked about reconciliation, but that reconciliation meant simply black people being told to reconcile with the poverty and white people to reconcile with their wealth. And that is a recipe for disaster.
All right. Thank you so much for being on the news with me, Sipho, and congratulations to South Africa.
Thank you very much.
All right.